And that's Webpack. So, well, obviously not all of Webpack. There's still a whole lot of configuration options you can take a look at for very specific scenarios, particularly if you have issues with resolving file names, or you would like to resolve file names with different extensions, or you would like to change the folders in which Webpack will load modules, or you would like Webpack to not process certain directories and all that fun stuff. That's all available on the documentation and all available in the configuration. Webpack is a very, very flexible tool. So yeah, I mean, once you kind of get your hands or a handle on these configuration options that I'm showing you right here, that these are the most important: your entry, your output, and your loaders. Once you have that, you're pretty much set to handle most scenarios when using Webpack. You want to load audio files? Find a loader that loads it, stuff it in your loaders. You want to do something like transform Angular files or something like that, throw it in a plugins. You want to add more entry points where you might have an additional page, throw it in the entry property. Most of the time, these are the configuration options you're going to be dealing with the most with Webpack, and knowledge of it will pretty much take you very far, except for issues, some edge cases that might come up. But in those cases, know that Webpack is definitely, most certainly, powerful and flexible enough to handle those scenarios. So if you haven't guessed it by now, Webpack is probably my favorite module loader, module bundler that I've personally used. I find the configuration takes a little bit to get used to, but once it does, it makes a whole lot of sense. I like how explicit it is in its configuration, so that you always know what's going on because, well, you were the one who configured it and it's just staring at you right there. I like its features. I like its file loaders, its URL loaders, its asset loaders. I like the way it does dependency management. I like how fast the dev web server is. The module hot loading works very, very well. It's all in all, it's a very powerful module bundler, and I definitely recommend getting practice with it, because the only thing that might put people off is it's slightly more complicated than the other module loaders we looked at. So Require.js, again, the pros are fairly straightforward execution when it comes to loading the page, but requires configuration to shim in modules that might not be so AMD friendly. We have Browserify, which works great for common JS modules and is incredibly simple to use. Browserify, if you have a smallish project, just throwing Browserify in there and putting it, even not even putting it in a Gulp file, just putting it in one of your scripts in a package JSON, very, very straightforward and easy to get up and running with. But then you have Webpack, which has a very rich plugin ecosystem, very powerful tool, and handles so many scenarios very, very seamlessly. So it really depends on what you want to go with. I mean, native support for ES 2015 module syntax and in-browser support for module loading is not going to be a thing for quite a few years, unfortunately. So I highly recommend people get familiar with the tools that allow us to use this functionality in our own projects, because it's so important, so important. The days of 10 million script tags that have to be meticulously sorted at the bottom of your HTML file, I think, are pretty much behind us now with these tools. And I encourage people to get practice and use them, even for small projects. Some things about Webpack I didn't talk about. We didn't look at using Bower. There is not surprisingly, there is a potential Bower integration plugin for Webpack. The thing about that, though, is generally speaking, Webpack really encourages you to use NPM modules and not Bower modules. Bower modules or rather don't necessarily always play well with module bundlers, whereas NPM modules or common JS modules typically do. And so if you can find your package on NPM, I encourage you to do so. And if you can't, there's nothing wrong with loading up Bower and setting up your configuration to search for those components in that case, or set up some config entries for that. There's documentation on how to do that, of course. Another thing we didn't talk about was the dev server middleware, but that has basically the same concept as what we did here with our dev server. The only difference is the dev middleware actually runs in a Node process. So if you're building a Node a server application, then using the dev middleware is definitely a good choice, because then you only have one server. But like I said before, the way I showed you guys is going to be the most flexible. Least config options and most compatibility with other sort of environments that you might want to use Webpack in. So stuff and things. Again, I encourage you guys to at least pick one of these three and get very used to it and use it in your projects. It'll make a huge difference. But I think that wraps up Webpack. And so I think we're going to move on to one last module loader. And there's a reason why I saved it to last, and we'll talk about that in the next video. And I guess we'll see you then.